to be here with you all and talk a little bit about this work that I've been engaging in for over a decade at this point. So I wanted to start off again by just saying thank you, and then I have a copy of my work for the museum. So this is a gift to you all. Thank you so much for this. I said it's being covered right now, but there's a little a display with several books on Latino Muslims behind here. And so it's really amazing to see that it's being recognized, the population is being recognized, the community is being recognized. And there is, in fact, as is noted in one of the labels here, a very long history of the community. And so I want to kind of just share with you some of the stories that I've come across while working with several people within the Latino Muslim community. And in fact, this is good. Part of what I do also is pay attention to the words that people use to describe themselves, or that other people choose to use to describe other groups, right? And just this weekend, I saw for the first time, a Latino Muslim referring to themselves as a Latinx Muslim. Is anybody familiar with that? With an X, yeah. Right? Yes. So it's this like variable. So an unknown, but it's in Spanish language. Every noun is or objects are they have genders, right? So it's Latino is the male gender, Latina is the feminine, and so if it's a woman, you would refer to her as a Latina Muslim. But if it's a mixed gendered group, then what happens to the group? What do y'all think? Do we refer to the mixed group as in the female or the male pronoun?
No.
In the male, right? Same thing when we have a group of women, you might say ladies or women, let's do this. But if it's a group of mixed people, you would say, okay guys, let's go, right? So it often gets gendered in this way. And so a lot of people are within the community for a while have been choosing the X or Latina, Latino, Latino-a, or Latina-o, sometimes using the at symbol to include both genders at the same time. And even more recently, to help out folks who don't identify with either of the genders, there's this X to kind of signal a gender neutrality, gender ambiguity, and a lot of people within academic and activist circles have been picking up this term, and now for the first time I've seen a couple of references to Latinx Muslims. But I choose, even though when I refer to my communities, my parents are from Guatemala. I was born and raised in Los Angeles, and I'll say a little bit more about my biography, right, in my life, and how I got to involved in the work with these communities. But my wife's from Mexico, so my kids, we teach them a lot about Mexico and Mexican American history and culture, but also about Guatemalan and Guatemalan American history and culture. And we find that the Latino, Latina, Latinx categories are a bit broader for their identity, and so helpful. And so we identify as Latinx, and in my work, I use the word Latinx often. But when I talk about the broad group, but when I talk about the community itself, I always use the word Latino Muslim, because it's how the communities that I've worked with have self-identified Latino Muslim for the most part. But there might be a change, right? Looks like there might be a shift going on. As I'm already starting to see a couple of people. So that's something to keep an eye out on. So again, let's take it back. And a little bit about myself. As I mentioned, my parents are from Guatemala. It's a Central American country right below Mexico. And there was an earthquake in the 1970s. They had, my older brother was 6 months at the time. And so they moved to the United States. My grandfather was already here in Carson City. Is anybody familiar with Los Angeles area? No? All right, so in LA, right, so there's all these smaller towns and cities in Carson. And so he was a Pentecostal preacher in Guatemala, and a white missionary invited him, sponsored his visa, to come and start a Spanish-speaking congregation in LA. And so my grandfather was already kind of settled and doing well, and my parents came in illegally. And then in the 80s, there was an amnesty that happened. So by the time I was born, there was already a lot of shifts had occurred. I was born in Los Angeles. My older sister was born in LA. My younger brother was born in LA. So I was born and grew up in LA. But had lots of family that were living in the shadows for a long time and still do. And so the issues around immigration, legality continue to be a part of just Latinx experiences broadly. And it is also an aspect that comes up in Latino Muslim communities in particular as well. All right, so I'm very interested in the relationship between growing up between ethnicity and religion. When I speak Spanish mostly, when I ate pupusas, the ethnic foods from Central America, it was often in church that I did that. And when I went to school, I spoke mostly English and adopted a lot of non-Central American cultures and languages and aesthetics and so forth. So I had this kind of like dual identity. And in fact, at school, I was my first name is Harold, and at home, Harold is actually a really hard word to say in Spanish. I don't know if anybody's experienced it. So like, my in-laws call me Jaros because it's hard for them to pronounce the words. And so at home, it was my middle name, Daniel. So always Danielito, and so I had these kind of dual identities, like a Latinx identity, and more of this Americanized English-speaking Harold identity, and it was kind of dual. And oftentimes, Latinx communities will have those kinds of experiences in individuals. So I was interested in the ways in which my parents would go to church to try to connect with, right, their heritage, with their people, and how important it was to me and my family growing up. So when I finally got to college and started doing philosophy and religious studies, I wanted to explore that connection between ethnicity and religion. But the more I looked at it, the more I realized with my professors that ethnicity in the United States it's something very interesting happens to ethnicity and ethnic identity. It becomes racialized in ways that it might not become in other countries and other places. And so when I get census and it asks you to identify yourself, and there is no brown option, right? So it becomes a little confusing. You can pick the Hispanic or Latino category, but that's an ethnicity. And then what do I pick for my racial identity? And it's just over and over again this idea that somehow your ethnicity is passed on genetically through heritage, through descent, and that certain kinds of cultural aspects go along with that. And we'll see some of that in my presentation in mass mediation of Latinx identity. We'll see that oftentimes Latinos are racialized in the United States. That is, that their identity is thought to have some kind of proclivity towards certain kinds of actions, like spicy religion or radical religiosity, right? Very, very, very momentous, fluid, wanting to dance and move, and that this is somehow embedded in the blood of our ancestors and passed on genetically. So I think that's problematic. I think the history of race and ethnicity in the United States, it needs to be addressed when talking about Latinx communities and Latino Muslims in particular. Right, so I started working with a particular group in Los Angeles, the Latino Muslim Association. Martha Galadari was the president, and still is the president of that community, and just started developing relationships with them and going. They had baby showers for both our kids, and so the kids grew up learning how to be within these communities, and it's been a blessing, and it's been a great journey. And the best part of the work has absolutely been the relationships that I've developed with individuals and groups and communities. And so to be a part of this community in some way, as a researcher, as a friend, as an ally, has been an amazing experience. Right, so I want to turn a little bit to some other research now. And if you have any questions along the way, please do feel free to stop me. I want this to be more of an informal conversation. Have any of you seen this film, Every Mosque? So I highly recommend it. It follows the life of Hamza Perez, him and his brother Suleiman Perez. Were hip-hop artists. Hamza is no longer rapping as far as I know. But he was using this art form as a form of dawah, and so he's trying to reach out, and you see it in a couple of scenes in the film where he's trying to connect with a couple of Latinx members and reach out and teach them about Islam through the music, so reaching out. And the film follows his life, but starts out with the focus on his artistic work, his artistic renditions, thus the name New Muslim Pool. And so the film wanted to initially look at Muslim youth culture, and in particular the use of hip-hop culture within Muslim communities in the United States. And once it found this individual, the whole film instead focuses on his life and really focusing in on his domestic life. And I found it really interesting, the film, for a couple of reasons. So he himself is a very magnetic personality, very charismatic, very fluid with his words, very bright, very, very smart, and a pleasure to speak to. But he's also very complex, and that's one of the things that was alluded to in this very brief sort of synopsis, right? So all kinds of identities, right? You're this, you're that, you're this, you're that. Sound like you're America's worst nightmare. Did you all catch that phrase, right? Why do y'all think that was the conclusion? Why would his multiple identifications be something like America's worst nightmare?
That is so real. And he was so honest. I mean, that's what, after the election of 2016, there was this white guy who was this church was mostly white people. And one of the things that he said that popped in my head when he said that on white day he asked the guy, well, how do these poor white people know that they have something to feel? They said they could turn on the radio. And there used to be a white person coming on Sunday to preach, and now they speak Vietnamese.
Yeah.
So now you see people like him with these multiple identities, breaking people in worlds of what the world's supposed to be like.
Yeah. I think that's absolutely part of it, right? You don't know how to handle it. We have these conceptions of who people are, and we put a label on it, and then what do we think? So it's not just a label, right? It's not just a word, it's not just an identity. It becomes with this whole host of expectations of what they're going to be like, what kind of languages they should be speaking, how will they respond if you say certain things. And so if they have multiple boxes, then it's kind of like, how will they respond? How am I supposed to address them? And there's a fear of the unknown, right?
Yeah. And also each layer has its own stereotypical threat.
Exactly.
Every single layer, the Latino, then the Muslim, and then the gay.
The gay, right.
So each layer has its own, by itself, could be looked at as a threat. For example, the Latino, the immigrants here taking over, that kind of stereotype. And the Muslim, we already know, terrorist, armed, and then bring in the gang background, and then you just put a lot of the stereotypes together.
It's sort of it's just one negative stereotype on top of another, on top of another, right? And this is, in fact, going to be something that Latino Muslims will narrate about their experience over and over again. So multiplying marginality. So that if they identify as one of these categories, they're already marginalized for it, or they experience negative sort of pushback because of these stereotypes. And then they adopt another one, and another one, and another one. They're just multiplying the negative experiences or the negative stereotypes. And there'll be lots of newspaper articles that have emerged, hundreds of articles on Latino Muslims, asking that very question: why in the world would you willingly choose to multiply your marginality or your negative? Why would you do that? You're already a Latino, that's enough, right? You were born that way. You can't change that, but why would you choose to embrace this religion that will multiply the negative reactions you'll get in the United States? And so I think it reveals a lot, right? Those kinds of questions from journalists themselves reveal a lot about what they think each category means in the first place. Right? They're coming at it with very negative stereotypes, absolutely. Right, so there's a lot there to unpack, but I want to let's see. There we go. Bring up a couple of different things. So our descriptive categories, whether we choose to identify a group or ourselves as Latino, Latina, Latinx, as I was mentioning in the beginning of the talk, right? That matters. It comes with political implications. These are not neutral categories. It's not like I pick up something and I describe it, oh, that's heavy, oh, that's light, and those are not neutral descriptions. They are descriptions that are in comparison to something else. Something is heavy only in comparison to something else. Something is light only in comparison to something else. And so whatever categories we use to describe are already laden with a lot of meaning, with a lot of especially political meaning. And so it's not just Latinx, but also Muslim, the category, whether one chooses to identify as Muslim or not. And this happens a lot in the Latinx Muslim community, where it's gendered as well. Women will oftentimes feel like they have to don the hijab to veil, and men will not be so easily identifiable. And so sometimes the men will go on years before revealing to their families that they have adopted or embraced Islam, and therefore get to pass without having those kind of negative interactions with their family that oftentimes come with it. Whereas women won't be able to do that if they end up choosing to veil, and it becomes a very contentious place. And so the ways in which people identify and choose to identify is very, very important. And when we describe what I found over and over again, and we'll get into some of the numbers later, but is that Latino Muslim communities, organizations, emerge in urban areas, in metropolitan areas, where you have a lot of diversity in those communities, right? So where you have large Latinx populations coming into contact with large Muslim populations in the United States. And so we describe those cities as diverse, as ethnically, racially, religiously diverse. But when we say something like Los Angeles is one of the most diverse cities in the world, New York City is one of the most diverse places in the world, that category diverse is already politically loaded. Right? So if you think about Harvard and its pluralism project, it's trying to take this word and convert it into a democratic strain, right? Diversity as a democratic strain. And if you go and talk to somebody else, that diversity doesn't mean a democratic strain, rather it means a challenge that needs to be overcome somehow, erased, that diversity needs to be melted down, right? So we get these kind of assimilationist models. And so whatever words we use, Latinx, Muslim, diverse, we want to keep in mind, even as from the film, as you all pointed out, these categories, they're not neutral, right? They're politically loaded. They are loaded with all kinds of meanings and stereotypes. So I think that's one thing that emerges. Another thing that comes up is his intersectionality, right? And as Kimberly Crenshaw teaches us, intersectionality isn't only about describing certain things. It's not just a sort of analytic process of going through people's multiple identities and saying, you see, everybody has intersecting identities. But instead, it's about putting those intersecting identities together in order to reveal structures of power, right? So when she's looking at legal cases where the company is being sued for racial profiling, they'll say, look, we actually have a lot of black men working in this company. And we also have a lot of women working in this company. But the fact is that the women are in one sector of the job and the men in the other sector of the job, and what there aren't a lot of is black women working in the company that aren't being discriminated against. And so what it reveals, the intersectionalities, is that power and structures of power aren't only in one racial category or one gender category or one ethnic category. It's at those intersections that reveal the structures of power that are oppressive. And likewise, when we talk about Latino Muslims, over and over again, the stories that we get is these stories of oppression that emerge from those intersecting identities. So, for example, when Latino Muslims are joining the IPNA, right, and they're being told not to speak in Spanish, that was one thing that emerges. Or they're hanging out with immigrant Muslim communities, and they're told that they're not real Muslims because of their ethnicity, that a Latino cannot be a Muslim, or that when they're hanging out with their Latino families, their Spanish-speaking families, and then they're told that when you embrace Islam, you're rejecting your heritage, your ethnicity. Why would you do that? Right? So often, Latino Muslims, when they embrace Islam, they experience at those intersecting points a lot of resistance, a lot of oppression, a lot of those negative stereotypes emerge because of it. Right? I think one of the things that I found most promising about working with Latino Muslims were things like the taco truck at Every Mosque campaign. Has anybody heard of this? So it started out in a few locations, and they wanted to have a taco truck available at the end of Ramadan, so that so I don't know if how familiar you are. I think in DC there's quite a few taco trucks. In Baltimore there's not that many, but in Los Angeles they're everywhere, right? And so if you see a taco truck and there's a line, you pull over and you get your tacos and then you keep going. So even if there's a taco truck at a mosque, and you're from Latinx community and you're hungry, you pull over and you start hanging out and you start talking with people. So it was a really neat way to try to get a bridge going on between two communities that actually align on a lot of similar issues, political issues. Right? So I think the Latino Muslim community can and is increasingly serving as a bridge between Muslim and Latino populations when it comes to issues around immigration, when it comes to issues of surveillance, when it comes to issues about negative publicity or negative stereotyping in the media. I think there's a lot of possibility for unification in terms of activist organizing. And so I think this intersecting identity of theirs can have a lot of potential, but there's also limits to those things as well. And so we see that over and over again, even in organizing these small Latino Muslim communities, people will have differences of opinion, differences of visions, and the communities, the small communities will themselves fracture, right, over and over again, creating ever smaller communities. And when there is an attempt to create a unified Latino Muslim organization, it presents lots of challenges. When a Latino Muslim organization just wants to exist at all, it's accused of causing a faction, right, a division between a broader American Muslim community. And so there are limits. I think there are promises, but also limits, practically speaking, to what identity politics can do. All right, any comments, questions?
It just sounds very similar
to a lot of,
to African Americans.
Yeah.
Especially the last thing you said about even just creating organizations to try to make sure you take care of yourself, and everybody's looking at you like you're divisive.
You're divisive, right? Yes.
Yeah, and assalamu alaikum. I think when you say the broader American Muslim community, if I'm wrong, Allah forgive me, but I think we're talking about the broader American migrant community, because there is a big difference between the migrant Americans and the native Muslims here in America. It's a big difference.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so what we mean by a broader Muslim community and who's making these accusations of being divisive is very important to point out, right? And so the communities that I'm talking about, for example, the Alianza Islámica, one of the first Latino Muslim organizations, emerged out of the IPNA, right? And tried to work with ISNA and was like, right, at the beginning. And now they're working very closely. So it's important to keep in mind those kinds of pushes and being brought into the fold and what's going on, what changed, right? What was the history that changed?
One question.
Yeah.
What is the motive? I don't know if you're going to get into this later, so you don't have to answer now. Do you have like what do you find are the motivators for them becoming Muslim, and what's the spiritual? Like, is there a spiritual motive? Because I hear a lot of identity and political motivations, but is there one underlying motivation that you found in your research?
Not one,
Okay.
but multiple. But spirituality had to do with like what kind of spirituality or what kind of experience. That is very individual,
Very
right?
individual.
And I think you have actually a really. Can I pull it out really quick? So a friend and colleague of mine, Juan Galvan, had been collecting reversion stories for a long time on the web, and then finally about a year ago put this together. And there's like a digital copy that's available as well. But this is a collection of just individual stories as to like what was going on in their lives and what led them to. And I think this is really important work, these collections of reversion stories that talk about, why is it that an individual chose to embrace Islam, precisely because of it's such a personal experience, right? But spirituality, I think, is throughout all of the narratives. So what I find interesting is I find the spirituality, the ways in which people make sense of the world through the Quran, very, very important. But also, I think what got me interested in religion in the first place, the academic study of religion in the first place, was to understand what were the political realities, right, in which my family sought to do religion after they had migrated to the United States. What did it offer them? And what were the limits of what it could offer? And so in my academic study of religion, I'm very, very much interested in in those kinds of questions along racial identity, ethnic identity, religious identity. What role does it play in nationhood, in policy making in particular, and how those policies impact communities of color, right? So that's more of my. But I think if you turn to this book, you'll see that what was the most important thing in their lives in terms of choosing to embrace Islam was a kind of personal crisis, and that they found answers in the Quran, or that they found maybe not like concrete answers to a particular question, though that happens often. Questions about they were raised to like think about God in this Trinitarian sort of manner, and when they embrace or when they learn about Islamic conceptions of God, that makes so much more sense, and so they embrace Islam for that reason. But other people will say that wasn't like a cognitive move like that. It wasn't a philosophical argument. There was something about like how the Quran sounded, right? Like there was something of like that just kind of appealed to me, and I wanted to be around it. Or there's something about the community itself and how they were embracing, how it was more of like a family than. So there's a lot of different.
There's no one particular.
There's no one particular
that stands out over the other.
Not so people and there's also we'll get into this. You and I can discuss it more, but there's also philosophically some difficulty in trying to hone in on one particular aspect, and that's actually related to what another aspect that I am interested in. So the film itself, the New Muslim film, that is a mediation of Hamza's experiences, right? So Hamza had a life, he still has a life, but he had those experiences, and then he narrates those experiences to someone who's recording him. And then that person who records it slices all the clips together, puts some sound bites in the back, interviews some people, puts it all together, and that becomes a mediation of his experiences, right? This is a mediation of very personal experiences. The authors have had time to reflect back on those memories of why they embraced Islam, have had conversations, have told these stories to other people, and now have wrote it, have gotten those stories edited, right, and rewrote them, and now they're being presented. So these are mediations of their experiences. The film is a mediation of their experiences. Yes?
Just to make things clear, so you're talking about people who are first generation Muslims, or recent converts, not people that have historically been Muslims.
So, good question.
Families have been historically Muslims.
Good question. So when it comes to Latino Muslim population, let me see if I can, over 90% of Latino Muslims are reverts, the people who are embracing Islam. And so like reverts or people who have reverted to Islam, because as I say, descriptions matter, and this community has chosen the word reversion over conversion. So we might call them converts, right? Over 90% of them are converts. They choose to describe as reverts. But yes, so then to answer your question, yes, people who are first generation, mostly, right? And there are a few, because Latino Muslim communities have been around since the 70s, maybe a little bit earlier. And so there are a few people who are being born into a Latino Muslim household. And that's actually a concern in terms of survival. So how long generationally can Latino Muslims survive? That is, will the children of Latino Muslims who are born into a Latino Muslim household, will they choose to identify as Latino Muslims? Or will they just identify as American Muslim? Will they drop that Latino part? Or will they leave the religion, right, and just identify as Latino? Or will they identify as neither of those and take on a completely different identity category? And so that's part of like how do you raise someone to be a Latino Muslim as well. And there are a few people, so but not many. Right? Any other questions? Okay. So here, as I mentioned, the majority of Latino Muslim communities and organizations are located in cities in which Latino and Muslim populations come into contact with one another.
Anybody thinking that LA and New Jersey, I guess? I mean, New York and New Jersey, you have two doctors.
Yeah.
So I guess one in New York City, the other must be someplace in New Jersey.
Yeah. Sorry, the tech's not working with me today, but yes. So Union City, New Jersey has a large Latino Muslim population. And in fact, that first photo that I had up here of Latino Muslim Day or Hispanic Muslim Day was in Union.
Where in Pennsylvania was that? Was that Philadelphia?
Pittsburgh.
Pittsburgh?
Pittsburgh, that was Pittsburgh.
Whoa, I'm from Pittsburgh.
Yeah?
That must be growing because, geez, that was not.
So
was
it's
that
not a
very
large,
recent?
it's a small community that decided to migrate, and they
And is
thought of
that
it as a hijra.
A lot of with Hamza present because I know he's.
Yeah, so this is like, so it's not, so the community itself decided to move, but the majority of that community does not identify as Latino Muslim, right? And so like Hamza does, and his brother who also does, and but the majority of the community is not Latino
He's a
Muslim.
Lamborghini.
Yeah,
Oh, no.
I'm sorry.
I missed the Pittsburgh part.
It's not working with me.
It's too loud.
All right, sorry. I'll back to the Mac later. I don't know what's going on. Yeah, so there's not a large community in Pittsburgh, so it's Los Angeles, San Francisco, New York, New Jersey, Chicago, Miami, Houston. I think you have a couple of photos from the Houston Mosque there, actually. And that was actually the first mosque that was built from the ground up as a Latino Muslim mosque, and they've actually had to give up that space, and they're currently
Where is that?
Houston, Texas. Yeah. So, but yeah, the Pittsburgh is like it's Hamza and his family, as far as I know. And I actually lived in Indiana, Pennsylvania for 2 years. If you're from Pittsburgh, you might. So I taught at IUP, and so when I would take students over to the masjid, Hamza would come out and talk to my students. And yeah, it was a great experience. And I had already been working on the research, so then when I wound up living near Pittsburgh, it was just really, really fortunate. So in kind of carrying this, like the theme of the mediation of Latino Muslim identities, this is really where I became interested in sort of my doctoral work. The ways in which experiences make their way onto newspapers, onto film, into music, and how that becomes the sort of public presentation of your experiences that then become coded as a cultural identity, right? And in terms of the mediation of Latino Muslims, let me just say briefly before I go to these mediations, Latino Muslims have been around since at least the 1920s, depending on how we code them, how we think of them. So in 1920s in California, there were these large farms in which immigrants from the Punjab, from northern India, were brought over to work on the farms, and so were migrants from Mexico. And given the sort of racist laws at the time, it was only men that were coming in from the Punjab and thinking they were going to work there for a few years and then go back. And they stayed longer than they thought they were, and they wanted to marry and have kids, but they weren't allowed to marry white women. And so who were the women that they could marry that they were coming into contact with in the farms? It was the women from Mexico. And so they ended up, in many occasions, having families. And the majority of those families and the men that were from the Punjab were Sikh or Sikh. And only very, very few of them were Muslims, but there were some Muslims as well. And so one of the earliest archived documents, instances in which there is a Latina or a woman from Mexico who embraces Islam is from these marriages. And she raises her kids as Muslims, but as adults, a lot of them did not continue to identify as such. Right? So this is what I was talking about, the survival of the Latino Muslim identity is dependent on the subsequent generations. And so there are a lot of conversations currently on how to do that. And in fact, people are writing like children's books. There's this belief that there's just not enough literature, children's books, cartoons, right, that kind of stuff for children to consume. And so they grow up consuming other kinds of mass media and then identify with those rather than anything particular to their identity.
Forgive me if you've already explained this one already, but from your standpoint and your research, what do you think is the biggest factor in the children of Latino Muslims who end up not identifying as Muslim in later generations?
I think that's a really good question, and this community is struggling with that. And I think we need to do much more research. So what I have is like just like personal people, like experiences that I've talked to, and from the parents' perspective, that it's a struggle, that they're fighting with a broader culture, that negatively identifies Latinidad and Islam, right? So I'll give you like a person, like I had cousins who would refuse to speak Spanish because they would get made fun of at school for doing so, right? And so they would pretend that they don't know Spanish when they absolutely knew Spanish, right? And that was the result of their children, right? So they, and if they're getting bullied and called names, and the easier thing is to like kind of distance yourself from that as much as possible, then the parents are worried that it's the culture, right? It's the U.S. And same thing goes with the Islamic identity, that if the broad is sort of culture is denigrating the identity, that it's easier for these kids to kind of like just kind of try to step away. So that's what I heard from the parents' perspective kind of quite frequently, that there's just not enough for them to kind of valorize. And so it's important, I think institutions like this are particularly important to kind of raise the profile. Like, you know, it's not like we're new to this. Muslims have been in the United States for hundreds of years, right, from its very inception. Latinos, and this, right, you know, Muslims have been in Spain. We're in Spain, we're in control of Spain for hundreds and hundreds of years, and hundreds of Spanish words come from Arabic, right? A lot of the culture, and so in as much as Latinos identify partly as being, you know, from colonial Spanish descents, right, at least colonizers, and that Spanish language is still part of that heritage, then Islam is part of that as well. And I think it's important that those histories, and I think that's very much what Latino Muslims are trying to do, to raise awareness of these histories that were systematically erased through colonial processes. So how do we do that? Right?
You mentioned earlier that it's been said that you can't be, by some people, that you can't be Latino and Muslim. Is that mainly coming from the Latino non-Muslim community, or is that coming from a pushback from some of the Muslim communities?
From both, right? So some of the Muslim communities will argue that, what does it mean to be a Latino? Right? What is the central component of Latinidad? And they'll like start listing things that come from negative stereotypes. What do y'all think those might be? Is it, like when you think of Latinidad, right? Latino identity.
See the Catholicism.
Catholicism, right, is very, very much a part of being. So like, you got to give that up. That means you're no longer Latino. Right? You got to give up like carnitas, these pork tacos. Right? You got to give that up. You got to give up the coronas. You got to give up the dancing. Right, and so like all these stereotypes of what it means to be Latino, it means you got to give up that Latinidad if you're going to embrace Islam.
So who's that coming from? Like that's the Latino community?
That's from some of the Muslim community who is consuming. Like, how are they interacting with Latinos? How are these Muslim communities interacting with Latinos? How are they getting these like ideas of what a Latino or Latina is? And it's largely from mass media.
And I'm sorry, one more question with that. And what segment of the Muslim community, I know you have a question. Yeah, what segment of the Muslim community do you find that? Is that African American or migrant? Both? Both? Wow.
And not all, right?
No, of course. I mean,
not all.
You know, nothing is all.
Yeah.
I was just,
and that is why. So like early on in the early history of Latino Muslim organizations, it was Afro Latinos who were within the. As I mentioned, the IPNA, they were in the Nation, and they're like Spanish wasn't really very valued, or they were told not to speak Spanish, and so it was the Alianza Islámica emerged initially out of a breakaway from African American communities.
I was kind of commenting on what you had said a little earlier. As a son of parents who reverted or converted, I find that one of the disconnects is between an older generation who found salvation in a religion versus a younger generation who didn't have context as to why it was important necessarily, and if you're not around the community of people who are also
Right.
practicing the same way, you're going to see yourself different, and naturally you're going to try and fit in with the larger crowd. So I find that it's almost like there has to be like a redefinition of what it means to be growing up in an American culture as well as culturally identifying with an ethnicity.
Yep.
In addition to that faith, that I think that a lot of adults can forget because they're coming from a whole different perspective. And it's like, as a child, you're like, oh, I'm part of the no fun religion. And everybody else gets to do this thing, and it's kind of presented to you as there is no wiggle room here. This is what you do. This is how you do it. There is no, okay, well, this is what's interesting to you. Let's figure out how it translates into this without compromising some of the principles of the faith.
I think you're right. And then, but I also sympathize with my parents in that generation who were immigrants in the United States, and they were struggling to survive, just like literally survive. Let alone, how do you pass on a culture, right? A whole like they're not.
That weight is heavy.
Yeah, I mean they're not. My dad was an electrician, right? And my mom was an accountant. And when they came over to the United States, none of that mattered, right? They lost all of that, and so they're just struggling to like find jobs and survive. But they're not, they're not poets, they're not novelists, they're not artists. How do you pass on a culture, right? And so if like you go to church and like that does it for you, right? So I get it, they were struggling to figure it out. And I think they leaned heavily on religion to survive, to have that Latinidad, that Central American culture survive generationally in me. But that absolutely, that's the way that you interpret it as a kid.
Yeah, it's almost like you have to look at it as like an onboarding thing. It's just like, okay, your parents were one generation and they came as different circumstances. Now that we're a generation in, what things translate to sort of setting a precedent for this now as opposed to the other way. It's always just like, okay, what's the 2.0?
Yes.
That was 1.0.
Yeah. And each generation has to figure it out on their own. Yeah. I think you're right. And then to come back to the kind of like lines within Black American communities, that Latinidad, right? So like that, we were having a talk at Morgan State last week. The Latinx Student Association, the Caribbean Student Association, and another student association co-sponsored a talk on Afro-Latinidad. And there was like these divisions between people that were, had one parent from a Black American family and another parent from Jamaica, or like both their parents were from Haiti. And they were just like worlds apart. Like these are completely different cultures, and they were having very heated debates as to like, are we part of the same sort of Black American experience? And I think the answer was over and over again, no, we have different experiences. And those walls get created. And so I think that's part of the walls that the early Latino Muslim communities experienced.
Okay, so putting together what he's saying, what you're saying, I'm guessing, this is just a guess, that a lot of what's happening is that people are defining ethnicity and religion by like by fixating on certain outward actions only, and that's what makes you that group. Like for example, if you don't do certain actions, this is what I'm interpreting, then you're not really holding on to your culture.
Yeah.
And then what's happening with second generation Muslims, whether from the Latino or from the African American or even white American experience, is that the parents are passing on basically a kind of subconscious cultural thing of these things have to be done. Obviously we know in Islam there are do's and don'ts, but it doesn't seem like a lot of people are understanding the foundation of the belief. That doesn't matter. Like, I don't want to say that the outward doesn't matter, but there are certain outward things that are fundamental, and then there are certain things that are optional. So what's happening is that, but with culture, I don't know that exists, that idea that there's a foundational belief system in your heart from your race, ethnicity, that makes you a part of that, even if you don't show any outward thing. So maybe what's happening with the next generation, I'm just guessing, is that they're understanding from their parents only the do's and don'ts, and then they're feeling like they can't carry that. I don't know. I'm just guessing from what I'm putting.
Yeah, it's possible, but I think also like it's hard to kind of separate the two in many occasions, the culture and the religion. Oftentimes, it's really they're entangled in very intimate ways, and so we find this actually in the second Latino Muslim organization that emerges, is Piedad, which is the Spanish word for piety, but it's also an acronym, the Propagación de Islam para el Divino. So the propagation of Islam on behalf of God the Divine. And this was a women's piety movement, a women's organization that was supposed to be a support group for women, Latina women who were embracing Islam. And they were embracing Islam after marrying a Muslim man, usually an immigrant Muslim man, right? And so we know that there is no compulsion in the religion, but a lot of the women were just statistically embracing Islam after marrying, right? Or like right before. And what kind of Islam were they likely to embrace?
Cool.
Right? They were going to embrace the kind of Islam that their husbands and their husband's mom, right? Oftentimes they would hang out a lot with the mom. And so the embrace of Islam also came with a lot of sort of cultural aspects that could not be disentangled. So they were cooking certain kinds of dishes and started wearing certain kinds of clothes, thinking that this was part of Islam. And so that group, the Piedad organization, their goal was to try to teach the women that there's a difference between the sort of tenets of Islam, and then like these other cultural aspects. But that's really difficult to do, and I applaud their work. But also in some instances, the culture is absolutely kind of entwined with the religion.
What's that acronym?
Piedad. So like, what does it stand for? So piedad is a Spanish word for piety.
Mm-hmm. So the acronym is
Piedad, la propagación de Islam y educación para el divino. So I'm going to skip over all these mediation things because part of what my work did was look at the coverage by journalists of Latino Muslims, and we saw that before 1999, there had only been one. There had been two, one in the Los Angeles Times, and before that, nothing for a long time. And after 2001, media coverage of Islam in general exploded, but of Latino Muslims was part of this as well. And so since then, there have been hundreds of newspaper articles and news coverage of Latino Muslims. And Latino Muslim organizations have responded. The organizations themselves have become the kind of like mediation, the gatekeeper between Latino Muslim narrative and experiences and the journalists, right? So when the journalists want a story, when they want to interview someone, who do they turn to? The leaders of these organizations. Right? And then these leaders of these organizations will filter out who they actually get to talk to, the journalists, and so they control the narrative as much as they can in terms of national coverage of who Latino Muslims are. And so that's part of what I do, but we'll skip over that part. So 1987, how much time do I have? We're like over, huh? So I'll breeze through this last part, a brief history of Latino Muslims. In 1987, the Alianza Islámica is formed, and I've talked about them a bit, but Rahim Ocasio, Ibrahim Gonzalez, and Yaya Figueroa come together to found this. And they envision, Alianza means alliance, right? And it's an activist organization. It's fighting against something. It's fighting both against civil rights abuses, so a lot of individuals had been fighting within civil rights movements. Had actually experienced some burnout, and then were reinvigorated through Islam, the spirituality of Islam. So in terms of like, what is it that actually called to them? For them, it was absolutely the spirituality. That they believed that what had gone wrong for some of their other work that they had been doing was that there wasn't enough spirituality embedded within the civil rights movements that they had been engaging in.
Say what had gone wrong in terms of what they perceived or defined as their failure?
A lack of spirituality within the movement itself. Mm-hmm. And so when they found Islam, it kind of reinvigorated their work. And you see that they were doing things like they had GED programs, AIDS awareness. They were burying Muslims who had died of AIDS when nobody else would bury them at the time because of the stigma associated with it. They had like martial arts classes to kind of protect the neighborhood. And so they were doing a lot of kind of services and self-empowerment type of activities that they had been engaging in their previous organizing before. Then after that was Piedad, as I mentioned, was this women's piety movement that sought to teach women who were embracing Islam and learning about Islam through their husbands. And so they wanted to empower them. The next one was Lado, which means side, and they had a slogan like Puro Latino, Puro Musulman, a su lado. So pure 100% Latino, pure 100% Muslim. We're here at your side to help you, support you, in being both 100% at the same time. Because, right, if you're saying I'm 100% Latino and I'm 100% Muslim, why would you have to articulate that? Because you're being accused by people that, like, that's not a possibility. And so they have a lot of their narratives were trying to address that kind of accusation. But LADO it's an acronym for Latino American Dawah Organization, this one here. And they, and that's Juan Galvan, he's been the director for a long time. And it is, most of their activities are done online. So they have a huge collection of resources in Spanish language that they've put together there. And then the community that I worked with closely was LALMA, the Los Angeles Latino Muslim Association. And that's Marta Galadari, and that's Muslim Sadiq. And so they had a previous scholar in the way, one of the ways in which they navigate gender and power issues, because they don't have, since the Alianza Islamica, Latino Muslims have not had their own spaces. And so the majority of these organizations meet within borrowed spaces of mostly immigrant Muslim communities. And in order to maintain access to those spaces, a lot of people within these spaces are worried that something like the nation will happen, that they will develop their own kind of theological versions of Islam that are not in keeping what they maintain as Orthodox Sunni Islam. And so that they, in order to avoid that, must have a Muslim scholar that is sponsoring those communities, those organizations, to make sure that that Muslim scholar, usually male Muslim scholar, is making sure that they are being led on the right path, right? But they still have the authority in terms of which Muslim scholar they're going to work with, right? And they'll kick people out and bring them in. And so they have negotiations with those gender dynamics in these sorts of ways, and the space themselves. And so Muslim League was like very surprised that one of their previous scholars had told them that they were asking about prayer. And they're like, well, it has to be in Arabic. And they're like, well, what if I can't learn Arabic? Well, you just memorize some of these words. I'm like, what if I can't memorize them? And in those occasions, if at the very beginning you can pray, you can say your prayers in Spanish. And so he was very surprised by that. And there was a heated debate between some of the people there. Alrighty. So I want to conclude with just showing a couple of numbers of where we're at now. If I can get to it there. So 93%, this is in Spanish and I'll translate it right now. 93% say Latino Muslims that we surveyed said that they were not raised as Muslims. Right, so that the majority are reverts, or what's often called converts. 62% were born in the United States, so 48% were not born in the United States. 73% are women. 49% are between 18 to 34 years of age, so relatively young, and 40% are from between 35 and 49. 91% identify as Sunni Muslims, 8% as Sufi, 8% as Sunni and Salafi, 6% as Shia. And these slides are, the Prezi is available publicly if anybody wants to check that. And there's actually a study that with Juan Galvan, the author of this book, a statistician, Gaston Espinosa, and myself put together, and that's available free online as well, and I can make that, give you the reference for that later. So that has all these details. 31% of Latino Muslims descend from Mexico, 22% from Puerto Rico, 12% from other places, other countries in South America, 9% from countries in Central America, 5% from the DR, and 3% from Cuba. There's a growing population in Cuba. Yeah, there's some important work to be done there. So this was kind of like back in terms of when I was saying that those boxes don't actually fit. So we use the same census categories to be able to do comparative analysis. And we had the other box, and a lot of people checked the other and then wrote in brown. It's not a, so it's kind of surprising. So 28% of Latino Muslims identify racially as white, 23% as brown, 6% as black, 3% as American Indian or Alaska Native, 12% is biracial, 21% is other. All right, so I think one of the things that in concluding, one of the most important things that I took from, that I've learned from working with Latino Muslim communities is the importance of memory. And so religiously, just performing zikr, like prayers over and over again, fasting, and how important that is for developing character, but also remembering one's past and heritage, and how often they'll talk about the Islamic heritage and past that is embedded within the Latino culture that they continue to embrace and try to pass on to their children. So the role of memory just kind of stuck with me in terms of memory and spirituality. It wasn't something that I had given a whole lot of attention to before, and I'm now paying a lot of attention to. So now my current research focuses primarily on memory and religion in Baltimore, and the role of public art, so murals, statues. I don't know if you all heard about the Confederate statues in Baltimore disappearing overnight, and a newspaper article just came out a few days ago that they're like all kind of just rusting out in this one place, right? But you see all these empty pedestals throughout Baltimore, and it's kind of like a memory that was attempted to be erased, as if that never happened in Baltimore. And so I'm very, very interested in the role of memory. How is it passed down, and what does it do for our communities and our spirituality? So again, thank you so much for having me. If you have any questions, I'm happy to sit around and answer them.
Thank
Talk
you.
with you.